Hello and welcome to Business at 9 with me, Ankita Saxena. Well, a grand welcome for Prime Minister Modi is being done by Russia, one of India's oldest allies, as he landed in Moscow for his first bilateral trip since coming to power last month. Over the course of the next 2 days, PM Modi and Russian President Vladimir Putin are expected to address issues including Russia's ongoing war with Ukraine, sanctions by the West, and bilateral trade. Meanwhile, in what is being seen as a clear message to China, Russia's first Deputy Prime Minister Denis Mantrov received PM Modi at the airport. This reception with the highest-ranking Russian official below Putin is in contrast to Xi Jinping's welcome, where lower-ranking Deputy Prime Minister received the Chinese president. So, what does PM Modi's Russia visit mean for India-Russia ties, and what will be the implications for a global geopolitics going ahead? For that, we're joined by Suresh Goel, who's a former ambassador, and Suhasini Haider, who's a diplomatic AD at the Hindu. Hi, welcome, Mr. Goel and Ms. Haider on the show. Well, I'll begin by asking you, Mr. Goel, India and Russia, they're one of the oldest and the most time-tested friendships that we have seen, on the global front. And this is Prime Minister Narendra Modi's first visit after coming to power in Modi 3.0, and also the first visit post the Russia and Ukraine conflict. What does this mean for India and Russia relationship?
First of all, I think even though Ukraine is an important international event, but I would like to take Ukraine out of India-Russia bilateral equation for the time being. Not that it is not an important event, but I think if you talk about the bilateral connections between the two countries, India and Russia, we need to really think more beyond Europe. Ukraine is basically, as the EM had said earlier, is a European problem. They will deal with it. It's a NATO problem. It's a European security issue. We have far weightier issues. But we have issues closer to our own region, security region, India-Pacific, across our continental borders, Central Asia. So we need to think in a little different manner. And therefore, I will keep Ukraine out of the equation for the time being. Number two, I got a sense that there was a comparison being made between India and China as far as Russian treatment of the two countries is concerned. Those comparisons can be risky. And I would not like to get into those kind of risky territory purely on the ground of who receives whom. Important, but it also depends upon who is the Deputy Prime Minister dealing with which country. And therefore, I will leave it out there. Suffice it to say, really, I think strategically speaking, India and Russia are an important relationship, both in terms of global strategic metrics, as well as Central Asia. SCO is an example of that, and the India-Pacific. Now, the fact is that Russia, even though far away from India-Pacific, but Russia has a vested interest in playing a role in the Pacific. It's an important country. Russia-China partnership is an important factor. And therefore, India has to be very, very cognizant of what Russia and China are all about. And therefore, our traditional partnership, traditionally very, very warm partnership, strong partnership. Please remember 1971, when Russia actually and India, we were together in many ways. And therefore, I think we have to determine the relationship between India and Russia in its own metrics. And I think, therefore, for Prime Minister Modi to make the first bilateral visit to Russia immediately after re-election is an important indicator of the importance we attach to Russia and how we view the relationship with Russia, particularly in view of the triangular or quadrangular, whatever you want to call it, China, USA, Russia, India. We will have to really be extremely adroit player on the scene to be able to find a way on it. Ankita.
Right. So, Suhasini, I'll come to you then. like Mr. Goel mentioned here, that while yes, the representation when the Chinese president was received is while that is important, he doesn't want to get into the comparisons. But the fact that Russia also met China and now we are meeting India. Is it a strong signal that Russia is trying to send out to the global allies, to the West, of its ties and its allies, the allies on its side, because it has been castigated and isolated for a while, and now with this, it's trying to send out a strong message to the West of its growing friendship?
I think so. I think that there's no question that there is a geopolitical context to this visit, even though officials have consistently said, look at the bilateral, look at the bilateral context. But even so, what we're seeing is, as you said, President Putin has in the last few months met with the Chinese president. He traveled to Vietnam. He traveled a few months ago to the UAE. He's been very recently to North Korea. And now he's hosting Prime Minister Modi for a summit that has been put off for 3 years. So there's definitely a message that Russia would like to put out, that it is not possible to isolate a country like it. In Kremlin parlance, they use the term that the global majority is really engaging with Russia, while the Western coalition, and remember, there is a NATO summit in Washington in the next 24 hours that will begin. And you'll see other leaders as well from the Western coalition of sanctions against Russia, including Japan, South Korea, and others being there, as well as the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. So they'll all be in Washington sending out the message that they intend to try and put Russia on the back foot in terms of the conflict in Ukraine. And at the same time, for Prime Minister Modi to be here in Moscow to meet with President Putin in this very intense way, that over a period of 2 days, the two leaders are going to meet on several occasions, is, I think, a message on its own. So you're quite right. That is a message Russia would like to put out. As far as India is concerned, the India-Russia relationship dates back decades, as you pointed out. And they'd like to see the primacy of that bilateral really being restored.
You very rightly pointed out that the NATO countries are just all set to meet in Washington. The US is set to host all the NATO countries, whereas our Prime Minister Narendra Modi is now in Russia. What does it mean for Russia? Now, you said that Russia, of course, would like to send out a signal, telling all the West, the Western countries that it has its allies on its side. It has countries have its back. But what about India? How does it impact India? Of course, it has great relationship with the Russians. But what about the rest of the world that is actually going to meet up in Washington very soon?
India has consistently said that it does not wish to get into this kind of bloc politics and to get into a sense of one side versus the other. I think the Indian position has been consistently one in favor of dialogue and diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi is expected to give a message to President Putin to say that there is no solution to the conflict on the battlefield, that any solution to the conflict must come from dialogue between the two stakeholders. And there is a certain amount of a tightrope that we have seen New Delhi walk. Just a month ago, Prime Minister Modi was in Italy for a multilateral visit for the G7 Outreach Summit, as it's known, where he met with the Ukrainian President Zelensky there, said he will support any peace process. As far as the Russia visit is concerned, it has its own importance. It's Prime Minister Modi's first bilateral visit abroad in this tenure. And remember, Indian prime ministers have traditionally always visited neighboring countries. So it's giving Russia really that sort of importance as much as a neighboring country for India, for a government that says neighborhood first is its policy. And I think that kind of tightrope will continue, where India, for example, sends a delegation to the Swiss Peace Conference, but does not become a part of the outcome statement that is issued after that. India has consistently refused to sign on to any UN resolutions that criticize Russia. It has abstained from all of those. But I think that the importance of this visit is much more in terms of what Prime Minister Modi and President Putin are going to discuss in terms of dealing with the issues that have arisen from the Ukraine conflict. So things like food, fertilizer, and fuel security, things like the recruitment or the misleading of Indians to be recruited by the Russian military. And now we have seen the deaths of 4 Indians at the front line with Ukraine, something India wants to end right now, wants to see them get a military discharge as soon as possible. Talk about the delayed deliveries of Russian military hardware. And most of all, I think what is going to be at the top of the agenda is the economic issues arising, given the kind of worries about sanctions, Western sanctions on Indian companies, on Indian banks, how the two sides can work out payment mechanisms as well as trading facilitation so that Indian companies that are manufacturing much needed goods for Russia are able to send those and are able to offset the huge bilateral deficit right now caused by India's purchase of Russian oil. So if the deficit right now is about 50, 55, $56 billion, whereas India has been buying about $60 billion of Russian oil in the last year and exporting only about $4 to $5 billion.
Right, right. So, Hasini, you've highlighted a couple of things that could be on the agenda, but I'll come to you, Mr. Goel. Now, the meeting is already underway, so Hasini has highlighted a couple of things that could be on the agenda. Do tell us, in your opinion, what could be, what are the other issues that could be discussed, and what are the likely outcomes of this bilateral talk?
There will be several issues, really. First of all, of course, is the return of the Indians who are participating in the war against Ukraine. There will be energy security issues, supply of oil, trade, etc., etc. There will be issues about Ukraine, as Suhasini mentioned. There will be issue regarding the whole issue of, and I think Arctic also might figure in the considerations because as well as the connectivity to Russia in terms of trade, there will be a whole host of issues. But I think primarily, if we want to look at what actually Prime Minister Modi and President Putin, and after when the two heads of government meet, they do not talk about basically dollars and cents. They talk about basically strategic issues. And in my own thinking, what is going to happen really is, whichever way it is reflected, how do we look at the evolving situation in the region? I think essentially China is going to be a factor. I think essentially US, what US actually wants out the whole visit, and the Western countries and the Western bloc has already basically raised some flags about the visit. I think those are the things which are going to matter a lot in terms of overall strategic equations in the region.
Okay, so Hasni, I'll come to you then. A couple of things there. Firstly, the Chinese president also met Vladimir Putin, and so did Narendra Modi. And of course, we also have the US elections coming up now, right? China, India, not very great relations, and also US and China, of course, are again, not the best of friends. Now with both China and India meeting up with the Russian president, how does the geopolitics of it works? Like now with the US also holding the NATO countries, in some time we will see the meeting also happening there, and with the US getting into elections, how is the geopolitical situation going to pan out?
Well, I think what you are seeing in terms of the Russia-Ukraine conflict is perhaps for the first time in this post-World War II situation. For the first time, not only are you seeing this kind of conflict involving a P5 member in Europe, you're also seeing that it's really about territorial integrity and transgressions of a nature that we have not seen in the past. There are many who even suggest that the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine conflict could actually see a new world order emerging. What is certainly clear is that there is the Western coalition that has ranged itself against Russia, China. And then there is the global south that India has taken up the cause of, has said that it is hoping to amplify the voice of the global south, that says we are being affected by the conflicts of others, particularly when it involves these global powers, on issues that are most important in terms of development, in terms of food, fuel, fertilizer security. And therefore, the countries need to find ways to deal with these issues that don't affect a large part of the emerging and developing world. So I think geopolitically, that is those are the questions that are going to have to be answered, regardless of how the conflict ends, whether there's an actual resolution of the conflict, or whether the conflict gets frozen. Because remember, we have seen 2 years of fighting in that space after Russia's original invasion of Ukraine and annexing of certain territories, and then there was a referendum that brought those territories, according to the Russian constitution, into Russia's territory. We haven't seen too much in terms of territory moving back and forth. So even if that territory it gets frozen, the question is how are other countries who are being affected with it go forward? Which is why I keep saying that the economic issues are likely to be the driver of the conversation Prime Minister Modi is going to have with President Putin. And India is going to try and push for a situation where it is not expected to choose one side or the other.
All right, India will make sure that it is not in a situation that it has to choose a side, and of course, economic betterment is going to be on the agenda. And like Mr. Goel mentioned, that this Russia-Ukraine situation is going to come out. When it gets over, it will probably bring out a new world order. But on that note, Mr. Goel and Suhasini, thank you so much for joining us today on the show.
If you like this video, then like, share and subscribe to ET Now.